The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and Corporal James Jimmy Caldwell was beginning to forget what dry socks felt like. He crouched in the narrow doorway of what had once been someone's home in the Italian village of Soma Colonia, watching sheets of cold November rain sweep across the Serchio Valley like gray curtains drawn by an invisible hand. The year was 1944, and the mountains of Tuscany had become a graveyard where young men from Alabama and Georgia, from Harlem and Detroit, from places that had never wanted them as equals, now bled the same red into foreign soil. Jimmy was 23 years old, though the war had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. His hands, calloused and perpetually dirty despite his attempts to keep them clean, trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette with matches he'd traded from an Italian partisan. The tobacco was harsh, Italian-made. Nothing like the Lucky Strikes he remembered from before shipping out, but it was warm in his lungs, and that was enough. Behind him, in the ruined kitchen of the stone house, 3 other men from his squad huddled around a can of Sterno, heating water for coffee that would taste like mud but provide a few moments of comfort, in a world that had forgotten what comfort meant. These men were his brothers, though not by blood. They were bound by something deeper than family, something forged in the peculiar hell of being black soldiers in a white man's army fighting a white man's war. Private Thomas Tommy Jackson from Mississippi, who could fix any radio or engine but couldn't read the manuals that explained how. Private First Class Robert Hayes from Philadelphia, a former postal worker who wrote letters home for the men who struggled with words. And Private Earl Williams, barely 19, from a tiny town in South Carolina that Jimmy couldn't remember the name of. A kid who should have been worried about girls and baseball, not whether a German bullet had his name on it. They were part of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, one of only 2 black combat divisions in the entire United States Army. The white officers who commanded them called them the Colored Division, with varying degrees of contempt or paternalistic concern, depending on the officer. Some believed black men couldn't fight, couldn't lead, couldn't be trusted with anything more complex than digging latrines or unloading supply trucks. Others, a precious few, saw them as soldiers first and worked to prove the doubters wrong. But all of them, every single one, served in an army that was as segregated as the Jim Crow South they'd left behind. Jimmy took a long drag on his cigarette and let his mind wander back, just for a moment, to Birmingham. He could see his mother's face, round and kind, always smiling even when there was no reason to smile, even when his father came home from the steel mill so exhausted he could barely eat before falling into bed. He could see his younger sister, Grace, 12 years old when he'd left, probably 15 now, probably beautiful, probably dealing with the same hate and fear that had shaped his own childhood. He remembered the day he'd gotten his draft notice. He remembered his mother crying in the kitchen while she fried chicken for his going-away dinner. Remembered his father's hand on his shoulder, heavy and warm, and the words spoken so quietly they were almost a whisper. You go do what you gotta do, son. You show them you're a man. You show them we're all men. Training had been its own kind of war. Camp Robinson in Arkansas, where the heat was suffocating and the racism was worse. White soldiers ate in separate mess halls, used separate latrines, drank from separate water fountains. The officers, mostly white Southerners who'd never commanded black troops and didn't want to, made it clear that they expected failure. During drill exercises, Jimmy's platoon was given older equipment, insufficient ammunition for target practice, less time on the rifle range than white units. When they excelled despite these obstacles, when they marched straighter and shot more accurately than expected, the praise was grudging, delivered with surprise that felt more insulting than any slur. But there were also moments of pride, fierce and burning, moments when Jimmy and his fellow soldiers would gather in their segregated barracks and sing hymns their grandmothers had taught them. Songs about freedom and deliverance that meant something different now, something deeper. Moments when they proved to themselves, if not to their commanders, that they were warriors, that they deserved to be here, that they would not be broken. The journey to Italy had been long. They'd shipped out from Newport News, Virginia, in a transport that was segregated even on the open ocean. Black troops confined to the lowest decks where the smell of diesel fuel and vomit mixed into a nauseating cocktail. When they'd arrived in Naples, the Italian civilians had stared at them with a mixture of curiosity and wonder. Many had never seen black people before. Some were afraid. Others, especially those who'd suffered under fascism, saw liberation in any color. Jimmy remembered a woman in a village south of Rome, an old grandmother with a face like weathered leather, who had pressed a medal of St. Christopher into his hand and kissed his cheek, tears streaming down her face as she thanked him in rapid Italian he couldn't understand but felt in his soul. He'd kept that medal in his breast pocket ever since, a talisman against bullets and hate. The Gothic line where they were now was Hitler's last defensive position in northern Italy, a series of fortified mountains and valleys designed to bleed the Allied advance dry. The 92nd had been pushing through these positions since September, taking casualties, gaining ground inch by bloody inch. The Germans were tough, well-trained, and they didn't care what color you were when they aimed their rifles. In some ways, Jimmy thought grimly, the battlefield was the only place where he'd ever been judged purely by his ability to fight rather than the color of his skin. But even here, racism followed, when units of the 92nd had faltered during attacks. The white press back home had blamed it on racial inferiority, ignoring the inadequate training, poor leadership, and impossible objectives that would have challenged any unit. When they succeeded, the victories were attributed to the white officers who commanded them. It was a war they couldn't win, no matter how many battles they fought. The cigarette burned down to Jimmy's fingers, and he flicked it into the rain, watching the ember die with a small hiss. Behind him, Tommy called out softly, "Coffee's ready, Corp. Better get it while it's hot." Jimmy turned and moved back into the relative shelter of the ruined house. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, and half the roof had collapsed under artillery fire weeks ago, but it was home for now. Hayes handed him a tin cup filled with steaming brown liquid that barely qualified as coffee, and Jimmy wrapped his hands around it, letting the heat seep into his bones. "Any word on when we move out?" Williams asked, his young face tense with the fear he tried to hide. "Not yet," Jimmy replied. "But soon. Captain wants us to scout the ridgeline tomorrow morning, see if we can figure out where that damn sniper is operating from." The sniper, they've been dealing with him for 4 days now, and he'd already killed 2 men from their company and wounded 3 others. The Germans called their snipers Giger, hunters, and this one was particularly skilled. He never shot from the same position twice, and he had an uncanny ability to find targets at ranges that seemed impossible. He favored headshots quick and clean, and he'd become a ghost that haunted every movement the Americans made through the valley. Yesterday he'd killed Private Daniels, a quiet man from Atlanta who'd been planning to open a barbershop after the war. Daniels had been moving between buildings following proper procedure, keeping low and fast, but the sniper had found him anyway. The bullet had punched through his helmet as if it were paper, and Daniels had dropped without a sound. By the time they'd recovered his body, the sniper had vanished like smoke. The psychological weight of being hunted was crushing. Every window became a potential death trap. Every pile of rubble could hide a rifle barrel. The men moved through the village like ghosts themselves, hunched and fearful, knowing that somewhere in the mountains above them, a German soldier with a scope was watching, waiting, choosing his next victim with cold precision. "I hate not being able to fight back," Jackson muttered, staring into his coffee. "Just sitting here like ducks, waiting for that bastard to pick us off one by one." "We'll get him," Jimmy said with more confidence than he felt. "We just got to be smarter than he is." Hayes laughed bitterly. "Smarter than a Kraut sniper who's been doing this since Poland? Good luck with that, Corp." But Jimmy's mind was already working, turning over possibilities, remembering things he'd learned, things he'd read in field manuals that officers assumed black soldiers wouldn't understand. Snipers were patient, disciplined, but they were also human. They had patterns, habits, weaknesses. The trick was finding them before they found you. That night, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll in the corner of the ruined house, listening to the rain drum against the remaining sections of roof, listening to the distant thunder of artillery somewhere to the north where other men were dying. He thought about the sniper, tried to imagine the man behind the rifle. Was he young or old? Did he believe in what he was fighting for, or was he just another soldier trying to survive? Did he ever think about the men he killed, or were they just targets, just problems to be solved through crosshairs? Jimmy thought about his own kills, the German soldiers he'd shot during firefights, the grenade he'd thrown into a machine gun nest that had erupted in screams. He'd had to become someone else to do those things, someone who could pull a trigger and watch a man fall, someone who could live with the weight of taking life. War made killers of them all, regardless of whether they'd wanted to be, but this sniper felt different. This was personal. This was being hunted by someone who'd elevated killing to an art form, someone who had all the advantages of terrain, concealment, and patience. And Jimmy was tired of being prey. The broken helmet had been lying in the corner of the house for 2 days, forgotten among the debris. It had belonged to Daniels, dented and cracked by the sniper's bullet, a grim souvenir of sudden death. Jimmy had been staring at it for hours now, an idea forming in his mind that was either brilliant or suicidal. He couldn't decide which. When morning came, gray and wet like every other morning, Jimmy gathered his squad and outlined his plan. They thought he was crazy at first. Williams actually laughed, then stopped when he realized Jimmy was serious. But as he explained the details, as they began to understand what he was thinking, their skepticism turned to something else. Hope, maybe, or desperation. In war, the two often looked the same. The principle was simple, almost stupidly simple, which was exactly why it might work. Snipers looked for movement, for targets of opportunity. If you gave them what they expected to see, if you controlled when and where they saw it, You could predict their response. The broken helmet, mounted on a stick or rifle and slowly raised above cover, would look like a soldier carefully checking the terrain. An experienced sniper might see through the trick, but even a cautious one would have to take the shot or risk losing the target. And when he fired, when that bullet struck the helmet, they'd have the one thing they needed most, a muzzle flash to mark his position. That's assuming he falls for it, Hayes pointed out, and assuming we can spot the flash in time, and assuming we can get to him before he moves. I know, Jimmy said, but right now it's the only plan we got. We can't just sit here and let him keep picking us off. We got to do something. They spent the morning preparing. Jimmy took Daniel's helmet and examined the damage. The neat hole punched through the front where the bullet had entered, the larger, uglier exit wound in the back. He mounted it carefully on a broken broomstick they'd found in the rubble, positioning it so that it would look convincing from a distance. He practiced the movement, slowly raising it above the low wall that ran along what had once been the village's main street, then pulling it back down. They chose their position carefully. The wall provided good cover, and behind it was a doorway that led into a partially collapsed building with a clear view of the mountain slopes to the north. That's where the sniper had to be, somewhere in that tumble of rocks and scrubby vegetation, somewhere with a clear line of sight to the village. Jackson set up the squad's M1 Garand rifles at different points along the wall, creating multiple firing positions. If they spotted the sniper, they'd pour everything they had at his location. Captain Hendricks, their company commander, a white officer from Ohio who'd proven himself to be fair and competent, approved the plan with obvious reluctance. This is dangerous, Corporal. If he figures out what you're doing, he'll adjust, and we'll have lost our advantage. Yes, sir, Jimmy replied. But we're dying anyway. At least this way, we're fighting back. Hendricks studied him for a long moment, and Jimmy saw something in the captain's eyes that might have been respect. All right, but if this goes wrong, if you get yourself killed, I'm going to be very angry with you. I'll do my best to avoid that, sir. By early afternoon, they were ready. The rain had lessened to a cold drizzle that hung in the air like mist. Visibility was poor, which worked in their favor. The sniper would have to wait for breaks in the fog to take his shots, and those breaks would expose him too. Jimmy positioned himself behind the wall with the helmet on its stick, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. Hayes was to his left, Jackson to his right, both scanning the mountainside through the sights of their rifles. Williams was back in the doorway with binoculars, ready to call out any movement. Remember, Jimmy said quietly, the flash is going to be quick. Blink and you'll miss it. Soon as you see it, you start shooting. Don't wait for my order. Just shoot. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jimmy's hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. Every sound seemed amplified, the drip of water from broken gutters, the distant rumble of trucks on a mountain road, his own breathing harsh and fast. He thought about his mother, about Grace, about Birmingham, and all the things he'd left behind. He thought about Daniels and the barbershop that would never open. He thought about the sniper, somewhere out there, patient and deadly. Corp, Williams whispered. Fog's clearing on the north slope. Jimmy took a slow breath, then another. This was it. He positioned the helmet carefully, then began to raise it slowly above the wall, letting it peek over the top like a man cautiously checking the terrain. He moved it in small increments, realistic human movements that a sniper would recognize. Nothing happened. The helmet sat there, exposed, and Jimmy felt sweat running down his back. Maybe the sniper wasn't watching. Maybe he'd moved to a different sector. Maybe the crack of the rifle shot was sharp and clear, and the helmet jumped on its stick as the bullet punched through it for the second time. But Jimmy wasn't focused on the helmet anymore. His eyes were locked on a point about 200 yards up the mountain slope, where a tiny flash of light had momentarily pierced the fog. There, he shouted. 2 o'clock, halfway up the ridge behind those rocks. The rifles opened up, a ragged volley that echoed off the mountains. Jimmy grabbed his own M1 and joined in, firing at the position, bracketing it with rounds, watching rocks explode and dust kick up. They poured lead into that spot with everything they had, mag after mag, until their barrels were hot and their shoulders bruised from recoil. Then silence, broken only by the metallic click of men reloading. Did we get him? Williams asked, his voice high and tight with adrenaline. Don't know, Jimmy said, but we damn sure made him think twice about staying in that position. Captain Hendricks came running up, crouched low, his face flushed with excitement. Did you mark him? Yes, sir. North Ridge, 200 yards. Rocky outcrop shaped like a broken tooth. Hendricks pulled out his map, made quick notations. I'm calling in artillery. If he's still up there, he won't be for long. Good work, Corporal. Damn good work. But Jimmy wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Permission to take a patrol up there, sir. Confirm the kill. Hendricks hesitated, then nodded. "Take your squad. Be careful. If he's still alive, he's going to be very angry." The climb up the mountain was exhausting and terrifying. They moved in a tactical formation, weapons ready, every sense straining for any sign of ambush. The fog had thickened again, reducing visibility to barely 20 yards. Jimmy led the way, using hand signals to direct his men, feeling the weight of responsibility like a physical burden on his shoulders. When they reached the rocky outcrop, they found the sniper's hide exactly where Jimmy had marked it. The position was expertly constructed, a natural depression in the rocks, reinforced with carefully placed stones with multiple firing lanes and escape routes. Spent brass casings littered the ground, and there were signs that someone had left in a hurry, but there was also blood. Not much, just a few drops on the rocks, but enough to confirm that at least one round had found its mark. They followed the blood trail for about 50 yards before it disappeared into thicker brush and more rocks. The sniper had escaped, wounded but alive, vanished into the mountains like the ghost he'd been all along. "Damn," Jackson muttered. "We were so close." "We drove him off," Jimmy said, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. "He won't be operating from this area again. We took away his best position. That's a win." They collected intelligence from the Haida maps, notes in German that would be sent to intelligence officers, the brass casings themselves, which might provide information about the rifle used, and something else, something Jimmy tucked into his pocket without mentioning to the others, a worn photograph of a young woman and a child, probably the sniper's wife and son, smiling in some German town that was either rubble now or soon would be. Back in the village, word of what they'd done spread quickly through the company. Men came by to see the helmet with its 2 bullet holes, to hear the story, to shake Jimmy's hand and slap his back. For the first time since they'd arrived in Italy, Jimmy saw something in their eyes that had been missing: belief. Belief that they could fight back. Belief that they didn't have to be victims. Belief that a black corporal from Birmingham, Alabama, using nothing but a broken helmet and courage, had outsmarted one of Germany's trained killers. The Italian civilians heard the story too, and they treated Jimmy like a hero. The old grandmother who'd given him the St. Christopher medal brought him a bottle of wine. She'd hidden from the Germans, along with a loaf of bread that was probably a week's rations for her family. She hugged him fiercely, speaking in rapid Italian, and though Jimmy couldn't understand the words, he understood the gratitude, the relief, the recognition that he had made their village a little safer. A group of partisan fighters, ragged men and women who'd been waging their own war against the fascists, came to the American position that evening. Their leader, a stern-faced man named Carlo who spoke broken English, shook Jimmy's hand and presented him with a captured German knife, its blade notched and stained with history Jimmy didn't want to imagine. "You are a good soldier," Carlo said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "Color of skin, it means nothing in war. Only heart matters, only courage. You have both." Those words, spoken by a man who had no reason to care about American racial politics, who saw Jimmy simply as a warrior and liberator, hit harder than any commendation could have. For a moment, just a moment, Jimmy felt what it might be like to be judged solely by his actions, by his character, by his humanity rather than his race. It was intoxicating and heartbreaking at the same time, because he knew that feeling wouldn't last, that it couldn't survive the journey back to America. That night, as his squad gathered around another can of Sterno, Hayes raised his cup of terrible coffee in a toast to Corporal Jimmy Caldwell, the man who outsmarted a Nazi sniper with a busted helmet and balls of steel. They drank. Quote, they laughed. And for a few hours, the war felt a little more distant, the cold a little less bitter. But Jimmy found himself thinking about the photograph he'd found in the sniper's hide, about the woman and child waiting for a man who might never come home. He thought about how easily he could have been the one bleeding on those rocks, how easily any of them could die tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. He thought about the fundamental insanity of young men killing each other for causes that old men had decided were worth dying for. "You okay, Corp?" Williams asked, noticing his silence. "Yeah," Jimmy lied. "Just tired." But that wasn't quite true. He was thinking about what came after the war, whenever that might be. He was thinking about going home to Birmingham, to segregated buses and whites-only water fountains, to a country that would thank him for his service with one hand while pushing him to the back of the line with the other. He was thinking about how he'd proven himself here, proven that black soldiers could fight, could lead, could be heroes, and how little difference that would make when he took off the uniform. The war in Italy ground on through the winter. The 92nd continued to push north, taking casualties, gaining ground, fighting in conditions that would break lesser units. Jimmy and his squad saw more combat, more death, more of the horror that war offered in endless supply. But they also saw moments of humanity, Italian children playing in rubble, partisan fighters sharing cigarettes and stories, fellow soldiers of all colors finding common ground in the shared misery of the front lines. The sniper never returned to their sector. Whether Jimmy's bullets had wounded him seriously enough to take him out of the war, or whether he'd simply moved to another part of the line, they never knew. But the legend of the broken helmet trick spread through the division, then through other units, becoming one of those stories that soldiers told to remind themselves that even in the darkest moments, cleverness and courage could still prevail. Captain Hendricks put Jimmy in for a Bronze Star, writing a detailed commendation that described the initiative, tactical thinking, and bravery displayed in neutralizing an enemy sniper who had been terrorizing the company. The recommendation worked its way up the chain of command, through various headquarters, across the desks of officers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. It was denied. The official reason was insufficient evidence of significant enemy casualties. The unofficial reason, whispered through the ranks, was that the Army wasn't ready to pin medals on black soldiers. It wasn't ready to create heroes who might demand equal treatment when they came home. There were exceptions, of course. A few black soldiers had received medals, even the Medal of Honor, but they were rare enough to prove the rule rather than break it. Jimmy heard about the denial through Hayes, who'd heard it from a clerk who'd heard it from someone else. He nodded, unsurprised, feeling something inside him harden a little more. He'd expected as much. The fight he was really in, the war for recognition and dignity and basic human respect, wouldn't end when Germany fell or Japan surrendered. That was a lifelong battle, one his children and their children would still be fighting. But the men of his platoon knew what he'd done. The Italian civilians knew, the partisans knew, and in the end, maybe that mattered more than any piece of bronze pinned to a uniform. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Jimmy was in a small town north of La Spezia, drinking wine with his squad and a group of Italian families who'd survived occupation, bombardment, and the slow grinding horror of being trapped between armies. They celebrated together, crying and laughing, these people who'd been enemies on paper but had found something deeper than nationality or race, some common humanity that war couldn't quite extinguish. The journey home was long and strange. Jimmy stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching Italy recede into the distance, thinking about everything he was leaving behind. He thought about Daniels and the others who'd died, who'd stay forever in the soil of a country most of them had never heard of before the war. He thought about the sniper, wondered if the man had survived, if he'd gone home to that woman and child in the photograph. He thought about Carlo and the partisans, about the old grandmother and her wine, about all the Italians who'd seen him as a liberator, a hero, a man, when his own country often saw him as less. New York Harbor appeared through the morning mist, the Statue of Liberty raising her torch over returning soldiers who'd made the world safe for democracy, at least according to the newspapers. As the ship docked and the men prepared to disembark, Jimmy noticed something that made his jaw clench. The gangplanks were segregated. White soldiers to starboard, black soldiers to port. Even in victory, even after everything they'd done and sacrificed, the line remained drawn. Birmingham hadn't changed. The bus stations still had separate waiting rooms. The lunch counter still had signs that might as well have been written in his blood. His uniform, decorated with campaign ribbons and the patch of the 92nd Infantry Division, didn't protect him from the looks, the sneers, the casual indignities that came with being black in the South. But something in Jimmy had changed. He'd seen what courage looked like, had found it in himself and in men who shared his color and his struggle. He'd outsmarted a German sniper with nothing but a broken helmet and clear thinking. He'd led men through hell and brought most of them home. He'd been judged by the content of his character by people who had no prejudice against his color, and he'd found that he measured up just fine. His mother cried when she saw him, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. Grace was 17 now, beautiful and fierce, already talking about college despite the obstacles. His father shook his hand, then pulled him into a hug, and Jimmy felt the old man trembling with pride and relief. That night, sitting on the porch of his parents' house, Jimmy told them stories. Not the worst parts. He'd never tell them about the things that woke him up screaming, about the smell of death or the weight of killing. But he told them about the trick with the helmet, about his squad, about the Italians who'd treated him like a hero. He told them about men who'd faced impossible odds with dignity and courage, who'd proven themselves warriors even when their own country didn't want to acknowledge it. You did what you set out to do, his father said quietly. You showed them you're a man. You showed them we're all men. Yes, sir, Jimmy replied. But the fight's not over. No, his father agreed, looking out at the quiet street, at the world that needed changing. No, I don't expect it is. Years later, long after the war had become history, after the civil rights movement had fought and bled and died to change the laws, if not always the hearts, After Jimmy Caldwell had lived a full life as a postal worker, a husband, a father, and a man who carried his memories like sacred burden, people would sometimes ask him about the war, about Italy, about the sniper. He'd tell them the story of the broken helmet, about the simple trick that had saved lives and proven that intelligence mattered more than firepower. That courage came in many forms, that sometimes the best weapon was the one between your ears. He'd tell them about his squad, about men who'd fought for a country that didn't always fight for him, who'd proven their worth on battlefields thousands of miles from home. But what he remembered most, what stayed with him through all the years, wasn't the violence or the fear or even the triumph of that moment when the sniper's bullet struck the helmet and gave them their chance. What stayed with him was the feeling of being recognized, of being seen, of having Italian civilians and partisan fighters and even some of his fellow American soldiers look at him and see not a black man or a colored soldier or any of the labels that had been attached to him since birth, but simply a warrior, a leader, a hero. That feeling, brief and precious as it was, had shown him what the world could be if people chose to see each other clearly. It had given him something to fight for beyond survival, beyond victory. It had given him hope. And hope, Jimmy Caldwell knew, was the most dangerous and necessary weapon of all. It couldn't be broken by bullets or bent by hate. It lived in the hearts of men like him, men who'd faced death and discrimination and still chose to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Men who'd taken a broken helmet and turned it into legend, who'd taken the worst the world could offer and still found reasons to smile, to fight, to hope. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, had fought through Italy with distinction despite inadequate training, poor equipment, and the constant weight of prejudice. They'd liberated towns and saved lives and proven themselves warriors. Most of them came home to a country that still saw them as second-class citizens, that denied them the GI Bill benefits given freely to white veterans, that would take another 2 decades to grudgingly admit that separate was not equal. But they'd done their duty. They'd worn the uniform with pride. And in places like Colonia and the mountains of Tuscany, among ruins and memories and the ghosts of men who'd fought and died far from home, their legacy remained. The Italian people remembered. The stories survived. And somewhere in some box or drawer or museum there was probably a helmet with 2 bullet holes. Mute testimony to the day a black corporal from Birmingham proved that courage, intelligence, and dignity couldn't be segregated, couldn't be denied, couldn't be defeated by any weapon the enemy possessed. That helmet, broken and battle-scarred, was more than just metal and leather. It was a symbol of everything the war had been and everything the peace still needed to become. It was proof that heroes came in all colors, that leadership couldn't be rationed by prejudice, that the content of a man's character mattered more than any artificial division humanity created. And in the end, maybe that was the real victory. Not the defeat of the sniper, though that mattered. Not the liberation of Italy, though that mattered too. But the simple, profound truth that Jimmy Caldwell and men like him had proven, that they were soldiers. Warriors, heroes, and men deserving of recognition, respect, and remembrance. The broken helmet had outsmarted a sniper. But the men who'd used it had outsmarted something far more dangerous, the lie that they were somehow less, somehow inferior, somehow unworthy of the honor they'd earned in blood and courage. That was the legend that mattered. That was the story worth telling. And that was the truth that no amount of prejudice or denial could ever completely destroy.